Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026. Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast. Today, we are joined by our new friend, Murray.
Hey, hi, Murray. Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
So, Murray and I met months ago. You found me on Twitter, I want to say.
Yeah, I saw you in my Twitter recommended feed.
Thank you, Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And then you emailed me, and we got lunch. And I was like, Murray, he's a cool dude. And then when I started to organize with Rob, you came to our happy hour. Thank you for that.
Yes.
And then Murray invited us to volunteer with New Futures. So tell us, Murray, what is New Futures?
So New Futures is the only family homeless shelter in the Huntsville area. I think maybe like a 120-mile radius, the only family shelter. So
Wow.
Other shelters, they're segregated by gender. And so this one, you can have a whole family together. And I think I first came in contact with it in 2015 through my church. But yeah, and so New Futures.
Let me ask you though, look, so if you're a mother who loses her housing and you have custody of your children, like if New Futures didn't exist, like what would you would have to live in a tent, or like what would you do if you showed up to another shelter?
Honestly, don't know. It may be that mothers and children can stay together, but the fathers can't.
Oh,
That's what I've heard is that, yeah, it's like you can stay with your children, but like the entire family can't be together.
I
Like,
see.
Yeah, I've been told the answer before. I don't remember though.
That makes sense. Okay. So anyway, you were saying?
Yeah, so New Futures, it's a building that's sort of like you've been there, you can correct me. It's sort of like a long house, and it's off Masson Lake Road. And so it's sort of like a long house. It has a common dining area, common kitchen, and then several rooms. And so families will get a room each. And then New Futures has requirements that sort of like a compact, it's not the right word, but requirements for living there. You have to, follow certain sorts of guidelines and do certain types of things to stay in the good graces. Like one example is that I know of, it may be a little bit new. I'm not the expert, by the way. It may be a little bit new, but they do require the families to contribute money, but for families who can't contribute the money, they can do chores instead. I think that's relatively new. So yeah, it's communal living, and they try to help people transition, of course, into housing, like the families. And so there's been a lot of people that have transitioned out into permanent housing.
That's really awesome.
And how did you get connected to New Futures?
So I started going to a church called The Table, which is a house church. We say a United Methodist house church. And because it's a house church, we don't have a mortgage. And so we have 3 mission partners. I don't know how the people that were at the church before how they chose New Futures, but New Futures was chosen as one of the mission partners. So as part of that, the church gives money quarterly to New Futures, and then also serves meals. And so Beth Ryberg, she is kind of the head of preparing meals for New Futures. And so before the pandemic, we would serve meals, and we did more socializing back then in New Futures, and then we kind of got off track. During the pandemic, we stopped serving the meals for obvious reasons, but we've restarted now for over a year, and we're back in full swing. And so we try to go once a week, but there's a lot of weeks we have to take off for various reasons on Wednesday nights and provide a meal and, try to, be there with people just to generate friendships. We've generated friendships in the past with multiple families and gotten more involved, and then seen them transition out. And yeah.
And is homelessness something you had been involved in the past, or something you thought a lot about before you joined the table?
Yeah, so it's been something pretty close to me for a long time. Growing up, I went to the Methodist Church in Birmingham, Trinity, and my mom and dad were like counselors for the youth group, and my brother was older. And so they would be counselors kind of for his peer group. He was like 7 grades ahead of me. And as part of that, and part of just the church in general, my mom would go to the firehouse shelter. So there was a shelter in Birmingham that was formerly a firehouse that converted into a homeless shelter. People could spend the night and they would serve meals. I think it's still going. And so I went to that a lot with my mom. And so and that was in like elementary school. So I had really early experiences just with that environment. And certainly I remember, maybe the first times I went as a elementary school kid, it was pretty shocking. I just had not seen that like that before. But so I think it was formative for me to see that in elementary school. And then we continued doing that, all through growing up. And actually, I feel embarrassed to say it, but part of like my, I had to write an essay for college admissions. And part of my essay actually on the college admissions was related to homelessness. And it's just always been something close to my heart. I haven't, unfortunately, put as much commitment into it as my heart has been there. But, I was still active with some homeless groups and in college. And then another thing that was real formative for me in homelessness was, as part of the church, we had this thing called the UN Washington Tour. So a bunch of kids from North Alabama, junior year of high school, went to the UN in New York, obviously, and then to Washington, D.C. And there's this guy in D.C. who talked to us, who started a thing called the Olive Branch Community. I always remember him. His name was Harold Moss. And one of the guys, he was just very uncompromising. And I'm drawn to people who are uncompromising. And so Harold Moss was this homelessness activist. And he actually would just literally live on the streets with homeless people just to really, really be with them and be close to it. And it's just things like that. They just resonated with me. Like I, supported the Olive Branch community for a good while. And it just seems like, there's, it's people in need. And just kind of on a basic level, I think it's fairly easy to be touched by that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I hope you can edit this, by the way.
You're doing that. Perfect.
Though, if you'll not put your hand in your pocket, because it
Oh, rattles?
do you hear it?
I didn't
Yeah,
hear it. Okay,
it rattles. No worries. I'm constantly making extraneous noise.
That's why we use AI. AI just makes it all go away.
Yeah. Yeah. I never really thought about homelessness. Like when I was in high school, we did like a refugee camp where we like pretended to be refugees for a weekend. And that was, it's kind of cheesy and like cringe, but it's also, hey, the heart's in the right place. You want to give kids perspective, raise awareness. And then we did 30-hour famine, which I could never actually do. I never actually fasted for 30 hours. I couldn't make it.
That's a long time.
It really is.
But, that was the idea. So that was like world hunger. But yeah, homelessness was not something I remember really focusing on really until, besides like some personal brushes with it, like San Francisco is when I really started thinking about homelessness. So it's cool that you had that early experience to expose you to the issue. Do you have any experience with like systemic approaches to like solving homelessness as opposed to, providing direct services to people experiencing it?
What kind of experience are you talking about? Are you thinking about?
Well, organizing.
Ignore that.
Organizing for, laws and regulations that could alleviate homelessness or like reduce the rate of homelessness, or, just meeting people who are working on the issue from that perspective. There's kind of like, there's direct services. So that would be like shelter, food, transportation, the material things that a person experiencing homelessness needs, mental health, behavioral addictions, or, services, job training, yada, yada, services. And then there's the systemic, like the rights of people experiencing homelessness. So that would be like fighting the criminalization of homelessness, fighting for the ability for homeless people to not have to experience sweeps, and to, you know, reduce stigma against people experiencing homelessness, provide safer, you know, encampments, that kind of like systemic. And then there's okay, but how do we prevent homelessness on a systemic level, like on a policy level? Like, what are the policies and macroeconomic conditions that lead to homelessness or can alleviate it? And I'm just wondering if you, in all your homelessness experience, have encountered anyone working on it from that perspective or on that level.
Not really. I mean, the long answer is pretty much no, but I'm certainly interested in those issues. And that's obviously one of the reasons why I'm so attracted to what you're doing here, is because, yeah, my contributions have always just been like helping provide meals and things like that, which I think is good, but I think we need to be approaching all of the above. So I'm very interested in trying to solve the structural issues. But yeah, I don't have any experience. Just my own personal take is that, like, as a society, I think this needs to be greatly elevated on our priority list. You know, I would definitely say, at least in my opinion, you know, homelessness and maybe mental health in general should be like top 5 of like what we worry about as a country. And maybe in the last couple of years it's changed a little bit with the housing crisis, but I don't think it's anywhere near the top 5 personally. So no, I don't have anything to share, unfortunately. I'd like to get more involved and try to support where I can.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's kind of been my experience, is that of the people who are working on homelessness, 99.9% of them are working on direct services, which is obviously awesome and needs to happen. But if that is true, then it stands to reason we need more people to work on the alleviation and the systemic side.
Yeah, I mean, it would be so much better to have far fewer homeless people to provide services to.
Exactly.
And that doesn't seem to be worked on as much.
Right, exactly. I think we have one thing that struck me in San Francisco is the extent to which everyone had just accepted homelessness. Like, this is just what is, and we can't really do anything about it. And San Francisco spending, you know, fiscal year 2021 to 2022, $1.1 billion on homelessness, and the rate hasn't decreased significantly. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's an unacceptable status quo to have any amount of homelessness in the U.S. Like, we are too wealthy a country, and there's no technological reason for homelessness. It's not like we don't have the tools to build homes to house every human in this country. It's not like we don't have the resources to house every human in this country. So why do we tolerate a situation in which people find themselves without housing? Not only from like a human rights perspective, but as we've discussed in previous episodes, it's just a profoundly expensive and wasteful thing to tolerate, because whatever it would cost to house these people, it's costing cities more to have them be unhoused, you know?
I think that's one of the most infuriating parts of it. Is like there's literally no reason for this to happen. It is inefficient on every level, and just letting it go on is suffering.
Yeah.
So one of the ways I try to view things is like, what incentives do people have? Mm-hmm. And I don't feel like there's any incentive, or maybe I'm wrong, there's incentives for people to be homeless. I'm just curious what your explanation is for why we do tolerate it.
I think that the biggest reason is that the people who, and homelessness is a policy choice. We have chosen to implement and maintain policies that create homelessness. Like, reading a book right now called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And it's, two researchers who are looking at, all of the credible studies and doing their own empirical analysis and finding that, like, when you look at what causes homelessness on an individual level, then you find things like mental illness, physical disability, death and divorce, these things, job loss, like these things often will make a person more vulnerable to homelessness, but these factors don't cause homelessness. What they do is they study why certain cities have higher rates of homelessness than other cities. And it's the cost of housing. Like, that's the number one driver of homelessness, is the housing is too expensive. And so while someone with, a severe mental illness is more likely to end up homeless than someone who, doesn't have a severe mental illness, if that person with severe mental illness is in a context where housing is broadly affordable, they're far less likely to end up homeless. So they use the analogy of musical chairs.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah. So we need to focus less on, the person playing musical chairs with a broken leg is going to be more likely than everyone else playing to not have a chair to sit in. But why are we pulling out chairs? Like, the real factor here is the number of chairs. So I think we tolerate homelessness because the people who have the most power to implement policy are not, by and large, super concerned with homelessness. And the people who are super concerned with homelessness don't have the power, and often it takes a certain kind of personality to, read the studies and look into what causes homelessness. And I would say if I have asked, people who are working in homelessness, like, what do you think causes homelessness? And, they'll kind of sometimes say, like, oh, well, mental illness and addiction. But then when you have the conversation about, okay, yes, on an individual level, but like on a macro level, what causes homelessness? They can't afford homes. Housing needs to be more affordable. But they don't necessarily have the time and energy to pull away from providing direct services to go fight for the kinds of policies that would make housing more affordable broadly. So I think in the case of homelessness, it's kind of like a lot of political problems where the costs and the benefits are not equally distributed. So, for example, when you're debating whether to implement a policy that would make housing more affordable broadly, for example, you're suggesting that we legalize ADUs, mother-in-law units, accessory dwelling units. So we allow homeowners to build mother-in-law cottages on their property. Well, the empirical evidence could not be more clear that more units of housing reduce overall housing prices, and that reductions in housing prices reduces rates of homelessness. It's not assailable. We know that. But the people who are impacted by, lower housing prices, like their home values decreasing and there being more traffic on their street, and there being low-income renters in their neighborhoods where there used to be only wealthy homeowners, and their schools and their parks becoming more crowded. The people who are impacted in a big way, there are people who are impacted in a big way, and they make that connection. And so first they make the connection. They connect, okay, ADUs equal these negative impacts for me. Whereas it's not as obvious unless you've read the literature that ADUs would alleviate homelessness. So that's one issue. But then the next issue is the people who are negatively impacted by ADUs tend to be wealthier and whiter and older and less marginalized in every way. And so they have more time and energy and resources to advocate for what they want in any particular policy fight. So they're going to show up to the city council meeting and say, we don't want ADUs, versus the people who would benefit from ADUs, particularly homeless people and homeless people who advocate on behalf of people experiencing homelessness. They don't necessarily have as much time and energy. And we can see this again empirically. Like, the people who show up to city council meetings tend to be, on any issue, older and whiter and wealthier than the average person who's impacted by whatever policy we're talking about. So I think it's an issue of like concentrated costs, diffuse benefits, and the power differentials between who benefits and who sees a cost when talking about a policy that would actually alleviate rates of homelessness.
So what's the lay of the land in Huntsville, if you know yet? I know you're researching, as far as what kind of, and if you've already covered this in previous podcasts, I apologize, but like, what kind of rules do we need to get changed in Huntsville?
Well, I mean, if you look at our zoning code, which we didn't even have, so this week I was reading our zoning ordinance because I'm cool. We didn't have a zoning ordinance at all until 1963, which is also when the U.S. passed the Civil Rights Act. Coincidence? I don't know. But it didn't exist. Huntsville seemed to chug along just fine until 1963. Somehow we survived. But when you read the zoning code, the stated purpose of the zoning code is to limit density in Huntsville, Alabama, to increase livability and I'm quoting, increase the morals of our city. So, my preferred solution is to throw out the zoning code. We didn't need it before 63. We certainly don't need it now. Like,
and Houston does that, right?
Houston has, I've heard that they don't have zoning, but then I've heard that they do. It's just different. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think there could be an argument if there were like a lot of heavy industry or like heavy polluters that were trying to locate in Huntsville, Alabama, but like there aren't. So it's not clear to me like why we would need zoning at this point. And it's certainly not clear to me why we need density controls, considering how costly they are. The cost to benefit doesn't really work out, but any kind of upzoning. So an upzoning would be anything that increases the breadth of uses for a particular parcel. So, for example, I mean, the classic example why they call it upzoning is a height limit. If you reduce a height limit, you can build more units of housing on the same parcel of land. Same for if you reduce minimum lot sizes. So if you can build the same size building on a smaller lot of land, then you get more housing for the same amount of land. There's buildable area ratio, I think, bar requirements. So those impact density, setback requirements, parking minimums. I know Huntsville has height limits, and I mean, the biggest thing is like single family zoning, like eliminate single family zoning, or at least like vastly reduce the amount of single family zoning, which of course does not get rid of single family homes. It just says on a given parcel, if someone wants to build a duplex or an apartment or a mother-in-law unit, they're simply legally allowed to build on their property what they want to have on their property. Go ahead.
Oh, can I give you a test case?
Yeah.
So I saw like on AL.com within the last few weeks over on Hermitage Avenue. I don't know if you saw this. Are you familiar with that over in Blossomwood? So it's in Blossomwood, a nice area. My aunt lives over there. And on Hermitage, there was a developer or builder who this is like I don't know when it was built up, but maybe the 1920s, those kind of houses. And they tore down a house and then put in like these, it was like they were stacking trailers or almost like containers on top of each other to make like a much bigger house out of these like containers. And like I know that those residents threw up the red flag. They didn't like it, that it wasn't, and consistent with the rest of the neighborhood. So, just what do you think about that? How that's going to hurt? What those kinds of things? Sorry, it's kind of generic.
No, I think that's a perfect question. And that's exactly what you're doing. I mean, whether sounds like modular housing.
Yeah.
Or any kind of, like, I was watching a news segment of homeowners, one homeowner showing up to a Huntsville planning meeting to protest a new apartment complex near their single family homes. And one homeowner literally like crying because he didn't want to see apartments. And, I think it would be useful if people could understand that other people's ability to afford to live should probably get precedence over their aesthetic preferences. Like, your ability to not see apartments is probably not objectively more important than another family's ability to remain housed. 1. 2, when you block an apartment complex or modular housing or any kind of new housing, especially housing that is more affordable than McMansions and single family homes, you decrease affordability for everyone, which is not just expensive for those individual families, which it is, but it takes money out of their pockets that they could be spending on other things like better healthcare, better education, vacations, but not only that, it takes the money out of the economy. So when they're not spending at restaurants and they're not making investments, and all that money just goes to landlords and people who happen to buy their houses earlier, that's not a productive use of that money. And so Harvard economists have estimated that it costs the country as a whole billions of dollars in GDP lost to just density controls, to our refusal to build housing because we don't like the looks of it. And when you refuse to allow people to live in modular housing or apartments or kinds of housing that are more affordable than single family homes, you're locking those people out of opportunity. You're saying you don't get to avail yourself of the jobs that Huntsville has to offer, of the amenities Huntsville has to offer. You must be this rich to live here, which again is, I think, basically immoral, but also again robs the economy of what those people could otherwise bring if they brought their talents and their ambitions. But we're saying, keep out. It's really hard on the environment when people who do work here can't afford to live here and get pushed out and have to commute long distances. It's bad for public health when they have to drive long distances. Long commutes are associated with all kinds of negative health outcomes. So you're not just saying no thank you to one modular housing situation in your neighborhood. You're saying yes to a bunch of other stuff that I don't think people are aware that that's what they're doing when they're blocking new housing. And so if you really don't want to live next to modular housing, move. Why is it okay for you just because you bought a piece of land at some point to dictate what other people are allowed to do on their property. Like, if you don't want to live next to a certain kind of person, you can always live somewhere else. And if you really want to control who you live next to, you can buy the property around you until there's enough distance between you and any other person that you're going to be comfortable. But everyone in a community shouldn't have to suffer so that you can enforce your aesthetic preferences just because you happen to buy a parcel of property at a specific time, is my opinion.
Well, I hear you. I mean, I certainly believe that too. But would you see yourself trying to persuade the people who hold that opinion, or like raise awareness with them, or just like, forget about it, they'll probably never change their mind, we just need to get everyone else on board and forget about them?
That's a good question. And it's something I really struggle with, because I'll be honest with you, like, my default is like, fuck off, like, it is. It's just like, damn, how selfish and short-sighted could you possibly be? And, when I was watching that news clip, there was one guy who stood up and he was like, yeah, I don't like this because it decreases my property values. And I liked him the best of all, because I'm like, you know what? At least you're self-aware. At least you're honest. It really is that simple in a way. If the only thing you care about is your property value, well, it may decrease your it probably won't actually, but it could decrease your property value. And so, like, advocate for yourself, I guess. But these people who are like talking, they use coded terms like neighborhood character, or, preservation. I have a lot less sympathy for that. I think I would like someone to convince them. I don't know if it's going to be me. I do think that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. I guess what I would say, I guess the best I can do is say, you probably haven't thought about this.
Yeah.
I didn't think about it until I moved to San Francisco. Well, right before I moved to San Francisco. And I certainly hadn't thought deeply about it. And it's not a thing that a lot of people know. I mean, hell, I didn't know until recently. I'm like, it seems intuitive to me that if we build more housing, prices will decrease. But like, studies are still coming out, like, showing that this actually works. And so I think I would hope that people would simply have never thought about or would not realize that this is truly the calculus that we're faced with. That when we block housing, we increase racial segregation, increase economic segregation, increase economic inequality, like all these negative ramifications. And that's my hope. But what I will settle for is just acknowledge it. You don't have to agree with me. You can say my views are more important than your well-being. Okay. But just acknowledge that, just be like, yep, I know what I'm doing. I'm making this choice. And I do think that when it becomes clear to more people that that's the calculus, that that's the trade-off, that enough people have enough, either self-interest, because ultimately way more people benefit from every new housing development than the costs are concentrated and the benefits are diffuse, which means there's way more benefactors than there are people who lose. So just from a purely self-interest perspective, like, I think, we can get numbers on our side if people get motivated to show up and actually advocate for what will, for each individual person, be a small benefit, at least, like, indirect benefit. But I think, the benefits of having a society in which, having a city in which there isn't homelessness, and having a city in which everyone can afford housing, like, I think one of the things that's difficult is that it's impossible to quantify how much better that would be, because everything is interrelated, right? Like the drag on our economy of excluding people, and the drag on our economy of, like, you know, for example, homelessness will cause people to develop a condition like high blood pressure or diabetes sooner than they otherwise would. Well, those conditions are incredibly expensive, like on a per day basis. So, like, you know, if a person developed diabetes like 3 years earlier than they otherwise would, that's like a lot of money just in direct healthcare costs, besides like time not spent working, how quickly they get disabled, like yada, yada, yada. So the costs of not building enough housing are just incalculable in some ways. But anyway, if we can have an honest conversation about what's happening, I think that, you know, I will settle for that. But I think that when we can do that, people will get organized and people will get activated and people will advocate for more dense, affordable housing near jobs and transit.
I've probably mentioned to you before, like, I'm a subscriber to what Socrates said, that the only reason people don't do good is they lack wisdom or knowledge of the good. And I don't think that's 100% true, but, you know, I do think if raising awareness will make a big difference. But to play devil's advocate, so just, you know, it's just a dumb question. So, you know, if you fly over, there's a lot of unused land. So is there a way we could have, and I'm expecting you to, just by the way, to show why this is not the correct way to do it. The, you know, why, instead of like, you know, getting what people consider eyesores and Blossomwood built, why not just fill up all this unused land with dense housing? You know, over the mountain. I mean, there's tons of like land where there's not houses, or in this area.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's very different about San Francisco versus Huntsville, and why it's just it's extra unconscionable that we have homelessness, because we have so much land. I mean, I would say that it's important that homes be near things, right? That we want to have cities that facilitate thriving for their residents, and a city where a person can afford housing who might not be able to afford housing and a car, but they can afford housing near a job where they can walk or take transit or ride a bicycle. Like, I think that's really important for equity, but it's also important, like, for emissions and public health, to have housing near services and jobs and, you know, the places that people want to be. And so if there were some practical reason why we would want to, you know, have sprawl and codify car dependence, okay, but since the thing that would make building sprawl cheaper than building homes near, you know, retail and employment and services and schools is policy, then it just, to me, makes way more sense to change the policy to facilitate density. And again, like, for the people who don't like density for whatever reason, then leave that land for them, and have the density be far out. And you know, I'm not saying we should make sprawl illegal, but we shouldn't we shouldn't force it. We shouldn't codify sprawl, which is what zoning does.
Well, that was one of the things I remember about when we had Keith from Downtown Rescue Mission on. He was talking about another organization that had tried to do SROs and it had failed in the city. And it was a major blow because they were wanting to build dense housing like that actually had access to infrastructure, because most of the people that were going to live there needed access to the transit line. But by moving it out to the county, yeah, you lose access to a lot of infrastructure that people that are closer to the lower rungs of housing are going to need. And yeah, that would be just adding on to what you were saying. It's kind of like an active example of that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think sprawl and car dependence are okay if they're choices, but they're pretty bad things to legislate. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking it's almost like it sort of it sort of makes sense to give preference to where there is density to a more density.
Totally.
Yeah. But I don't know if that's a good sales point to the people who have their little patch of undenseness near a dense area.
People don't like change.
And I think, it's fine if people want to, if you like your single family home, you should be able to keep it. It's just that, you shouldn't be able to block your neighbors from turning their single family home into apartments. And there's just the costs of maintaining single family homes in city centers is so high, and I just want people to think through that, the costs and the benefits of single family zoning, if not single family homes, like the requirement that you can only build single family homes on 75% of Huntsville or more, 85%.
Well, I think I made a spreadsheet. Let me look.
But yeah, the vast majority of, land zone for residential in Huntsville is the only thing it's legal to build on it are single family homes. And it's
what percent?
It's between 75 and 85%.
Oh, wow. That's an important number.
I didn't do it by just residential. I was looking at total, a breakdown of all zoning.
Oh, okay. So an even higher percentage of residential.
So let's see. A multifamily percentage of all zoning possible in Huntsville comes out to about 15%. But if you account for there's some other zone types that allow for multifamily, technically, it could be up to 20% of all zoned land in Huntsville. And then I don't know the exact. I need to actually add up how much R1 has so I can get a dead comparison of just R1 to R2, because R1 is single family, R2 plus some exceptions for heavy industrial, light industrial, they technically allow multifamily as well. But for the most part, it's between R1 and R2. R1 single family, R2 multifamily. Zoning lesson for everyone out there. I could actually do that now while we're talking. But yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, you play devil's advocate to me for your listeners. So, my thought process is that we could just if there's a way to communicate, to spread the message out, that there'd be a lot of people who would feel the same. I know a lot of friends really, yeah. Homelessness is something I think most people have a natural reaction to. They're that's not good and we want to do better. We're a rich country. And if we could get that message out, we could probably make some change. Kind of lost my train of thought there. But so, I'm maybe oversimplifying it, but it just seems to me like it's a matter of priorities. I feel how can we make this higher priority? And if it is a high priority, it could be solved.
Yeah, totally. I couldn't agree more. It's kind of wild to me that we have someone in our city government in charge of music and not housing. To me, housing is the highest possible ROI policy change Huntsville could possibly make, because it impacts so many different aspects of life and it impacts every family financially more than any other expense. It is the vast majority of families' biggest expense by far. So if you lower the cost of housing, not only do you directly impact every family in a pretty significant way, but you also impact so many different facets of life. Like, again, racial and economic segregation, income inequality, overall economic growth, public health, environment, even things like domestic violence. Like, so many people stay in relationships they shouldn't be in because of the cost of housing. Like, so gender, and like, okay, more affordable, denser housing shortens commute times. Well, research has linked commute times to complications of pregnancy and like a greater likelihood of divorce. Like, a longer commute, more pregnancy complications, greater rate of miscarriage, higher rates of depression, higher rates of divorce. Like, so it's like everything is impacted in some way or another. Access to education by housing. So I don't know if there were another policy with a higher ROI if I'd be working on it, because I kind of just love housing, but I do feel very strongly this is the highest ROI thing we could possibly change. And I think that it's complicated, so that's difficult, but it's like, it is complicated, but it's also like extremely simple. Build more, prices go down. The reason we don't build more is because we've made it literally illegal to do so. Like, legalized building. You get more houses, they cost less.
Have you thought of that as a motto or a slogan, legalized building? That sounds like a pretty good one.
Yeah, I haven't, but
it's a bumper sticker.
Yeah, in San Francisco, they literally say that.
Well, maybe you should put the bumper stickers here.
Probably.
And so, like, the homelessness is clearly, I think the top issue, but man, I have so much sympathy. Like, let's say you're like a 30-year-old, newlyweds, like right now to like buy a house in Huntsville, total nightmare. It's like, I have so much sympathy for that. Like, I bought a house in 2012 and it was like just the luckiest time ever in retrospect. And I would hope that we also, just as a community, we also have a lot of sympathy that it's so nearly impossibly hard to buy a house anymore.
Yeah, I think there's a lot about Huntsville that makes me feel optimistic about our likelihood of actually making some positive changes. And one is that what I saw so much of in San Francisco is just this hard-heartedness. Just, I bought my house in the 70s and I made it illegal for other people to build houses, and my property values have increased an insane amount. And yeah, my kids can't afford to live here, but like, fuck them, fuck the next generation. Like, I got mine. And it was really horrible to see. And I feel like in Huntsville, there's much more of a heart for the next generation and for the people who are suffering. And there's much more of a shared obligation to care for each other and to not be, there are ways to invest and become wealthier that don't directly steal from people who don't yet live here, either because they have been born or because they weren't lucky enough to be born in a city that has a growing, thriving economy. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope that Huntsville can change course and not follow the lead of San Francisco, because that's what got us here. That's the reason that you could afford to buy in 2012 and people can't afford to buy today, because we haven't built enough, which is the exact same thing San Francisco did. But I'm hoping that if we educate people who, already have a heart for other people, that we can change course and have different outcomes.
Do you have any ideas on like how many housing units, like if you'd like to see built in Huntsville over the next 5 years?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is we need to build enough to close the gap, and we've imported way more people than we've built housing for. And I was looking at these numbers recently.
We were talking about it a while back. I remember.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the stats were.
I think it was like 5,000 to 10,000 units.
Was what we needed?
Yeah. It really,
That sounds vaguely right.
I don't know. I'll have to look it up. In San Francisco, they know exactly how many units they're short by, and it's so in California they have RHNA goals, and so it's like regional housing needs assessments, but they're toothless. So it's like, oh, you didn't meet your RHNA goals. Like you didn't build enough housing compared to how many people you imported. Like, shame. So yeah, and that's something that like Huntsville, we should also have every year. We should have like, okay, we imported this many people, we built this many units, we're this short.
Yeah, I was thinking that would be really great to see.
Yeah.
Just have like a metric of some sort.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's the thing is like, that should be, if our city government has one priority, in my opinion, it's that. Like, I don't think that our government should build the housing, but I think that our government should say, okay, we have imported this many people, the developers have built this many units of housing, what can we do to make those numbers match up? What red tape can we remove? What part of the permitting process can we streamline? What zoning do we need to change? How do we make sure we're not causing this mismatch? That should be priority number one, in my opinion. But hopefully very soon everyone will agree with me.
So what are your next steps?
It's a good question. I mean, right now, like I said, I read the zoning I got a flavor of the zoning ordinance. I didn't read every word. Oh, I'm not going to lie to you. I think like the two things we ultimately need to do are figure out, I know my ideal policy solution, which is set the zoning ordinance and the building code on fire. But I don't know what policy we can get broad support for. Maybe it's ADUs, maybe it's height limits. Like, I don't know. So like some understanding of an understanding of like who's operating in the space, who cares about housing in Huntsville, who could be made to care about housing in Huntsville, what policy solutions can they get behind, and then literally, I think, writing draft legislation and then advocating for it. I think that's so we would probably start at the city level, but I know other states have had. Emily Hamilton just did a study about state-based housing policy, and so like putting together a task force to start to write legislation that would preempt local zoning. So that's something we could explore as well. Maybe that would be more efficient, but I think it's reasonable to start at least at the city level. And yeah, just try to figure out like, how do we legalize density? Like, what is there a public appetite for? Who can help us advocate for it? And then, like literally, like, is this something that like the city council would pass, or I don't even know, like from a mechanism perspective, how that it would even get implemented. So these are things that someone can either tell me or I'll, otherwise try to figure out and then go from there. I don't know. What do you think our next step should be?
Oh, I feel like I got crackpot ideas. Okay, I'll Oh, no, I don't know. They're not worth saying. I mean, I'm more of a fan of like trying to like start with the popular support and then offer up the legislation that, you know, people just apply pressure to get it through. But I know nothing about politics. So.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what we're doing.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of the podcast is like find our allies, make new allies.
I just wonder, I mean, I always wonder about like advertising. Should we put up, you know, billboards, bumper stickers?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
I'm like the last person in the world to like know about that stuff.
Yeah.
But Rob.
Hey, if we get the advertising budget, we'll totally go for it. We'll blanket the city in bumper stickers. And, well, I don't know about bumper stickers, but it's digital billboards, online ads these days, if you can target them well. You're giving me a terrifying look. I'm terrified to speak.
What were you saying, Murray?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was interrupting. So my mom mentioned like recently that there's all these new apartment complexes coming up, and she was worried that's going to like reduce her property values.
Right.
So I think that's maybe a good area where awareness would help if we knew the actual numbers. Like, so then my mom would know, oh, well, we're still short 10,000 units.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good point because I think people see new apartment complexes, but they don't see newcomers, new humans. So yeah, if you don't have any data on like, and it's one of those things where it's like, well, have you noticed that rents have like literally doubled in the past 2 years?
Yeah.
How do you think that happened?
Yeah.
We imported a lot more people than we built homes.
So can I want to plug one idea of mine, which is just totally random plug. So you talked about burning up the legislation.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to pitch the idea just in general that as a society, we need forest fires.
Yeah.
To wipe out rules and legislations every 10 or 20 years.
Yes.
I really thought about this at work first. We just need to like just randomly.
Yes.
Random number generator, all these procedures get eliminated.
Yeah.
Just call it a forest fire because we get so much red tape. So anyway, I just wish we could do that as a society. But then the second thing was, I forgot. Go ahead.
No, I love it. I think that it reminds me of this article from Ezra Klein. Wrote a post called, it was about everything bagel liberalism. Maybe it was called Everything Bagel Liberalism, but it's basically about how, you know, we can't do anything anymore because there's so much red tape. And he gave as an example in the CHIPS Act, it wasn't a requirement, but it was like chip fabs would get preferential treatment if they had childcare centers on site.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one stipulation like that doesn't make much difference either way. I mean, it certainly has a cost, but like whatever. The problem is that these stipulations accrue, but they never go away. So then there are all these requirements or, you know, preferential situations, all these enticements to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And that greatly increases the costs and the time it takes to get anything built here. And, you know, each individual one usually has at least some reasonable justification, like all else equal, it's better to provide childcare is good. Everyone, you know, who has a kid and works needs it. But taken together, what will happen is that the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, and then the chip fabs just don't get built here. They get built in China where they don't have these kinds of requirements. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that like progressives really need to, I think we would all be better off if progressives would wrestle with the reality that trade-offs are real and that these requirements have a cost. The other thing that I like about the forest fire argument is it creates a really great opportunity for natural experiments. Mm. So let's say you've got two similarly sized cities with like a growing population, and one city, the building code gets lit on fire and the other, it doesn't. Like how,
Oh, yeah.
what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? Do we just get slums that aren't any more affordable, or does what I think would happen and you get a much wider variety of housing, including housing that's far more affordable? And while it may not be the kind of housing that, the kind of people who write building codes would want to live in, it's better than tents, which is what people are living in now. So yeah, no, I like it.
How sure are you that the zoning is the bottleneck? So let's say the zoning laws are burnt up tomorrow. Would there be enough labor and developers to build new housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at most, from what I've read, labor and materials are about half, and land and bureaucracy is the other half of what it costs to build housing. So I don't think that there's a lot of evidence that, materials and labor are just so much more expensive, are just so much a bigger percentage of the cost versus land and zoning and permitting, that you wouldn't see a significant price decrease. Could be wrong. Would love to find out, because that would mean we'd upzoned. But yeah, I don't think that's accurate. The one question is how much of it is zoning and how much of it is permitting. So let's say,
What's the difference?
so in San Francisco, they have what's called discretionary review permitting, which means the two options are by right or discretionary review. By right means if your housing project meets all zoning and building code criteria, then it gets a permit automatically. Discretionary means basically anyone can gunk up the process for any reason, even if your project meets all requirements, which obviously adds to the cost of building new homes. One study from the Turner Center at Berkeley found the discretionary review permitting process can add up to 10 years and adds like an average of $1 million to each housing development. So in Huntsville, I think we have a by right permitting process, but what seems to be the case is that because the vast majority of Huntsville is zoned for single-family homes, most of the multifamily development happens because the developer successfully advocated to rezone their parcel. So it may be that one of the biggest costs is in the process of rezoning the parcel. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. It's confusing, and I'm asking people and they're not telling me.
One day at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that we need. That's exactly what we need to know. Like, what's the main cost driver? What are the main cost drivers? Like, what are the highest ROI things to change? And that's one reason I would love to, if we set the building code and the zoning ordinance on fire, then I don't know, would you need a permit? What would be the criteria by which a permit would be issued? If it's your land, you get to build on it, which is kind of how I feel like it should be, which seems like the cheapest way to get things built. So, yeah. So then I wouldn't have to figure out what the most expensive part is, because it would just all be gone, which would save me time and energy, and create the most housing the most quickly.
Do you worry about what you're going to do in 2026 when this problem is solved?
No, not for 1 second. Oh man, now I'm thinking about it.
No. Stay focused, Cap. Got a big problem here.
I'm going to tell people in other cities how to do it.
It's like a productive thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I was just reading a paper on an upzoning experiment in Sao Paulo, and they increased the bar requirements and, found that it increased affordability and, greater supply, greater affordability, other welfare improvements. So it's a worldwide thing, so once we upzone the entirety of the US, like, let's upzone the world, and then let's upzone other planets. Let's eliminate, like, zoning. I want a world in which zoning is seen for what it is, which is a successful effort to codify racial geographic segregation, racial and economic geographic segregation.
Well, another test case for you. So, like, I like Santa Fe, and they must have just horrendously strict zoning rules on all the houses must look alike. I don't know if you've been there.
I've been there.
So, would you toss that out as well?
Yes.
Anybody could build ugly, weird houses next to the pretty adobe houses.
Absolutely. In 2 seconds, no question, no hesitation. Because you've always got places like, what's that fucking weird ass shit in Texas?
They're going to make me to use so many bleeps.
Sorry.
The algorithm is not kind.
Where's that weird budded stuff in Texas?
The explicit check mark when I post it.
You guys know what I'm talking about? The art colony? Marfa. Yeah, exactly. Like, I'm not saying you can't have your, like, beautiful adobe whatever you can have whatever you want to have, but you're not allowed to make people poor to have it. Like, buy the land and build it, and ideally don't buy land around where other people are going to buy land and build stuff you don't want to be next to. Because, like, America is so big. There's so much land. Like, it's wild. There's so much land. It makes no sense to fight about it. Like, if you don't like what somebody has built on their property, buy a different piece of property. Like, there's so much land and so much of it is so cheap. Yeah, I don't know. I do think the thing that I think gives me a little tiny bit of pause is, like, there's something cool about old stuff. Like, one thing I love about going to, like, Antwerp is, drinking in, like, 500-year-old bars. Like, that's cool. So I do understand the desire to do some historical preservation. However, the vast majority of historical preservation in the U.S. is complete and total NIMBY bullcrap. And, but it's like, okay, I believe that there are enough people who care about historical preservation, at least about the spots that, like, really matter to them, to, like, well, then just buy it. But I don't understand why force has to be involved. Buy it and protect it. I don't know.
I agree.
Anyway, thank you for interviewing me.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Hey, can I pay you guys a compliment? So I think this Housing for Huntsvillians, it's just like a great act of love. And, like, I hope that's attractive to a lot of other people, like, to get involved with that.
Oh, thank you.
It's mostly her. I just get to do the production work, which
Hey, everybody's got a role.
you have your stuff together on this.
I'm learning. It's an act of, it's like rage at injustice. But yeah, behind it is love. Ultimately, it comes from a place of love, but it often manifests as just extreme anger at, I don't know, like, not really the people, it's the systems, these systems that are implemented by people who don't know better and upheld by people who haven't thought about it and persist unnecessarily. And I think there's, just so much opportunity to do things better. And I'm excited to make friends with people who also want things to be better. And you are one of those friends, and I'm so glad that we met.
Oh, well, thank you. Right on, right back at you.
And thank you for being on the podcast.
You're welcome.
Anything else?
Not that I can think of. I'm trying to remember the time codes that I need to go bleep out. But no, not that I can think of.
Cool. Well, thanks for tuning in to Housing for Huntsvillians. Thanks to our guest, Murray, our guest and friend.
Yes.
Yeah. Catch you next time.
Power to the people.
Heck yeah.